going to go ahead and get started.
According to USA Today, as of January 2022, there were at least 280 proposals aimed at the LGBTQI plus community that have emerged in state houses across the country, with a focus on limiting gender-affirming care and access to sports for trans youth. Among these proposals are the executive action that I'm sure many of you have heard about in Texas, ordering the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate parents whose children use medically accepted gender-affirming care, and also Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, which significantly limits conversations about gender identity and sexual orientation in K through 12 schools, and was recently signed into law by Florida's governor. At today's event, we'll discuss these policies, how they are connected to rising violence and harassment of trans youth, and what we can do to support trans youth today, transnationally, nationally, and then locally here in New York as well. Before we begin, I'd like to very briefly introduce our panelists, and I'll call you all up and we'll go ahead and get started with the event. So first we have Bobby Hodgson, who's a supervising attorney at the New York Civil Liberties Union. I guess you can come up as I call you so everyone knows who you are. So Bobby Hodgson is first, where he works on statewide civil rights and civil liberties impact litigation. This includes a settlement agreement in 2020 that created a groundbreaking model policy addressing housing placement, safety, and access to medical care, name and pronoun use, and search procedures for transgender people in Steuben County, New York. Bobby first joined the NYCLU in 2013 as a Skadden Fellow, litigating and advocating on behalf of LGBTQ students, and he has worked extensively on advocacy related to LGBTQ rights. His other ongoing work includes litigation focused on immigrant rights, police misconduct, and transparency. And Bobby holds a BA from Harvard College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Next, we're delighted to welcome Professor Zain Mureeb. Zain is an assistant professor of political science and the co-director of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Fordham University. Zain's research and teaching interests are located at the intersection of scholarship on gender and sexuality, interest groups and social movements, and marginalized political identities in the United States. Zain's research has been published in numerous academic outlets, including Signs, which is an academic journal, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Politics, Groups and Identities, Politics and Gender, and New Political Science. Their new book, Brokering Identity, book project, Brokering Identity, explores the brokering of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender interest group coalition formation between 1968 and 2004. Zain is also a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, including 2 recent articles that explain the history between the rise of behind the rise of anti-trans policy in the United States. In addition, we're delighted to have Ryan Thorson with us today. Ryan is a researcher in the LGBT rights program at the Human Rights Watch. And in this role, Ryan has researched and written about the recent threats to transgender children and their families in Texas, Florida, and elsewhere across the country. Ryan is also the author of Transnational LGBT activism, working for sexual rights worldwide. So he's going to provide us a lot of context for looking at issues impacting trans youth transnationally. And he holds a bachelor's degree in government and women, gender, and sexuality studies from Harvard University, a degree from Yale Law School, and a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Oxford, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. And then finally, and last but not least, we have Joanna Wiest. Joanna is an incoming assistant professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College and a postdoctoral fellow in LGBT studies in the Princeton University Society of Fellows. And her research focuses on identity, political economy, and American constitutionalism. Her work on the American LGBTQI plus movement has appeared or is forthcoming in numerous academic outlets, including Perspectives on Politics, Polity, Politics and Gender, Law and Social Inquiry, GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies, amongst many others. And her writing has been featured in a number of national media outlets as well, including The Nation, Boston Review, Philadelphia Inquirer, Salon, and Jacobin. And her forthcoming book, Born This Way, Science, Citizenship, and Inequality in the American LGBTQ+ movement, is at once a celebratory and cautionary tale delineating a minority rights movement's impressive victories, its powerful and persuasive allies, and the inherent limitations of identity-based social movements and biopolitical citizenship claims in the face of right-wing assaults. We're really thrilled to have all of these excellent panelists with us this evening. For tonight's event, I prepared a series of questions to help spur what we know will be a very engaging conversation. I'll start with some general questions about your policy work or academic work on transjustice, and then we'll work into some more targeted and specific questions, and then with the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. And that includes all the audience members who are with us virtually. There should be a Q&A on your Zoom screen. Feel free to ask questions using that feature. We have a staff member here who will read through those and ask questions for you when we get to the Q&A part of the event. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started.
So I guess let's begin by just having each of you, I've described your general work, but not specific work on transjustice. Can you just describe specifically what you've done academically or policy work on transjustice, either here locally or nationally, globally?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Thanks again for having us, and thanks everybody for being here. As Erin said, my name is Bobby Hodgson. I use he and him pronouns. I'm an attorney at the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is the ACLU of New York, for those who don't know. So my work focuses a lot on suing people. We do have an integrated advocacy model that hopefully uses strategic litigation, policy advocacy, grassroots organizing, working with coalitions, and public education work to advance a lot of our institutional goals, and I lead the litigation efforts around our LGBTQ work. So over the past few years, a lot of that has, and again, I work in New York State, although we do work collaboratively with the national ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV project. So a lot of my litigation and policy efforts have focused around the rights of transgender people in custody, in local jails, state prisons, and in police custody, because that's where a disproportionate amount of trans people face violence, harassment, discrimination, in particular trans women of color. And so we've brought a series of cases on behalf of transgender women who were mistreated in local jails, state prisons, and in police custody. This really often includes people being denied access to necessary medication, being cut off their hormone therapy, people being housed inappropriately. So transgender women are generally housed in men's units inappropriately, which exposes them obviously to a lot of dangers, assault, harassment. It outs them. And in general, people's gender identity not being respected. So people are misgendered widely, their names are misused. They don't have access to basic, commissary items and things that are consistent with their gender. So we've had a series of strategic litigation to try and move the ball forward and get courts to confirm that all of these things are against New York state law and federal law and the Constitution. This works in concert with work we've done with coalitions across the state to get legislation passed in the New York State Legislature. There's currently a bill called the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act. Please look it up. That would codify a lot of the protections that I'm talking about regarding trans people in custody. Our work doesn't focus solely on people in custody. It's just where a lot of it happens to land. I'll pass it on, but very quickly, we also obviously deal a lot with people's access to identity documents that are consistent with their gender identity, in particular, including access to non-binary gender markers on government-issued identity documents, students' rights in schools, access to facilities consistent with one's gender identity, and the right to be free of government discrimination and harassment more generally.
My name is Zain Mirab. My pronouns are they, them. Thank you to Erin and the Roosevelt House for hosting this event. My academic work draws broadly on intersectionality as an analytic framework to examine movement formation and identity group membership. And I'm particularly interested in what happens when claims are made about who belongs and who doesn't. And so the recent piece that I wrote for the Washington Post, I want to just open with the kind of claim that while we see this anti-trans legislation making an impossible situation for trans youth by denying them access to what the American Academy of Pediatrics refers to as life-saving care, and banning them from sports unless they have access to that care is an act of erasure. And in my work in tracing the evolution of the LGBT group, what I see is that the elevation of gay, white, non-trans men as the prototypical member of the group has created the groundwork for these new assaults, in the sense that because trans people were foreclosed from group membership from the outset, that was the initial erasure, and that we're now seeing this legislation hook into those logics in order to create even more erasure. And I'm happy to talk about how this operates and how this is not just about gender, but also about race and class and all different facets of identity as we go deeper into the work. But for now, I'll pass the mic.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. So I work at Human Rights Watch, and the bulk of our work is really going out and interviewing people who have experienced human rights violations in different places, publishing reports, talking about those violations, and then doing advocacy around those issues. And my work in particular has focused on LGBT rights in the United States with projects that look at the experiences of LGBT kids in schools in Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Utah, Alabama, and Texas. Religious exemptions and barriers to accessing healthcare in Tennessee, Michigan, and Mississippi. And then most recently a report talking with survivors of anti-trans violence and their friends and family members in Texas, Florida, and Ohio. And one of the consistent things that we see at Human Rights Watch is that as many of these issues are painted as kind of elite, liberal, Western concerns around the world, the reality is that trans people disproportionately experience poverty, especially at the intersection of race and class. And a lot of the issues that we're documenting are really basic things that people are struggling with every day, right? Being evicted because they're trans, not having a bathroom to go to in school because they're trans, just exclusion from kind of the everyday fabric of life. And that's what we really try to emphasize in our work is that trans issues are baked into so many other human rights issues. And I think work from our Children's Rights Division and Women's Rights Division has been really helpful in illustrating some of those intersections. So I'll also talk about some of those later, but I'll pass it on to Joanna.
Sure, and thank you. It's really great to be with everyone tonight. I'm Joanna Wiest, she, her. So in my academic work, I'm broadly concerned with how forces outside of social movements help to win LGBTQ+ rights. So as Erin was mentioning in my first book that's forthcoming, hopefully sometime next year, on Born This Way, I look from the 50s all the way to the present and see all the way that civil rights advocates have interacted with and have built alliances with folks who are studying sexology, who are studying hormones, who are studying psychology and even neuroscience research, and how those kinds of studies and those ideas about what it means to have a sexual orientation or to have a gender identity that's at odds with the norm is oftentimes how these things are framed. How that sort of can be legitimated with scientific evidence. And I also look at how that can create liabilities. So for instance, I look not only kind of like Zane at people who are left out in those sorts of representations, but also how social conservative and right-wing forces sometimes are able to undermine that very science that those civil rights claims are based upon. And so we see that across not only issues involving sexuality and gender, but we see a kind of broader attempt to undermine faith in scientific and medical institutions. And I see those things as really wrapped together, the attack on gender and sexual minorities, as well as the attacks on things like COVID-19, climate change, all that sort of stuff. And then lastly, I've just started to work on a new book project that I've published a few articles on that explores how organized business interests sometimes fight for LGBTQ plus rights. So that's your Googles and your PayPals and those who have engaged in boycotts against discriminatory states that have passed legislation, anti-trans legislation, anti-gay and lesbian legislation. And then on the other side, more dark money right-wing groups that have also found an interest in attacking civil rights. And so I look at why that is, and again, that relates back to that undermining faith in science, but as I'll probably touch on a bit tonight, it's also a way that they find projects that can link attacks on civil rights and attacks on the regulatory state and government institutions kind of writ large.
Thank you all for introducing us to your work. I guess I'd like to just sort of dive into what's happening today across the country. So we've recently, as I said in my introductory remarks, we've seen just this surge of anti-trans policies that have really coincided with increased harassment and violence against trans youth in particular. Why do you think we are seeing so many of these laws now? Is this a new phenomenon, or is it connected to deeper political histories and struggles?
So I can kick this off. You know, I think we've seen kind of a steady increase in anti-LGBT legislation, at least since I've started working on these issues in 2015. I think what's changed this year is that many of the bills have been successful. They're meeting with new success where there used to be, I feel like, more room to kind of engage with law and policymakers and really talk to them about the harms that these bills would exact on trans kids. And I'm not quite sure why that's happening. I do think that it's tied into the assault on critical race theory and the idea that kind of parental rights have become a successful wedge issue in American politics. And then I also suspect that there's a sense in which after the Trump administration, law and policymakers feel more emboldened to bring these issues into the courts. One of the successful arguments that was used early on against some of the bathroom bills was that these would inevitably be struck down by the courts. This is not consistent with the way that federal courts have examined issues of gender identity. And I think, as you're seeing in the abortion context as well, state lawmakers don't feel deterred by that anymore, and that seems to have changed this year.
I think that's right on. Did I turn off? No. I think another aspect of this is that there are repeat offenders, right? These people are who have been drafting these bills have been doing it for quite some time, and it's also just the fact that they've learned a lot about their failures, and so over time these bills get crafted with more precision. They get crafted in much more insidious ways, and unfortunately, with the resources that you were talking about, and that with just the passage of time and these opportunities that are presented by the political moment, the same organizations that have been trying to draft these bills and bringing a lot of these lawsuits that you see over and over have simply changed their tactics to the ones that are succeeding, and then you see them proliferate. So there's certainly an aspect of, as time moves, these are people who are, and organizations who are learning and who are sort of crafting some of the most insidious stuff that you can imagine, and then running with what works, which is truly terrifying, and sort of like that's where we find ourselves now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I want to say is that this isn't a moment where only legislation that is anti-trans is succeeding. It's also a moment when there is legislation that is being passed that allows people to drive their cars into protests or to make protesting illegal in certain contexts and things like this. And so I think that at the core of all of this is a lot of mobilization that is targeted towards upholding white supremacy. And I think that if we look at that, and so if we think about the long mobilization that has been taking place that is anti-LGBTQ, at the core of it is preserving a sense of the white heteronormative reproductive family that is the cornerstone of citizenship in this country. And so it began with trying to stop or lesbians and gay men from being able to get married, and it has its legacy, or it's showing up now in this anti-trans legislation. What's interesting about the anti-trans legislation is that it shows it really explicitly by saying that it is attempting to protect young white girls from trans athletes. And so we see at every level the way the white supremacy is operating to retrench itself through this type of legislation. And so I would say that actually the focus on trans people or gender is actually kind of like accidental, right, to this broader project that is taking place and that has been taking place for a really long time.
I think what everybody has said so far is so important. And to pick up on that point, I think what's really fascinating is that some of these groups who are advancing this legislation and advancing anti-trans litigation are aware of this critique that Zaina has laid out. And a few years ago, the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is this multi-million-dollar group that has recently been shown to have taken money from Koch Industries, so fossil fuel industry is propping this up. And they chose a plaintiff, Alexis Lightcap, who's a POC cis woman, to say, we know that our anti-trans litigation is not motivated by discrimination. And that's because we understand discrimination. And so they create this kind of, this antagonistic version of intersectionality where they pit all of these kind of intersections against one another and say, there's no way to accomplish a policy, a liberal policy that is actually inclusive. And then to backtrack a little bit, I think the only thing I want to add to this conversation is that these laws that we see today are decades in the making, in that as early as the late 1970s, we saw the first formation of some of these big social conservative groups like the Heritage Foundation, like the Council for National Policy. And these groups were funded by right-wing money, right-wing industrialists like Joseph Coors of the Coors Brewing Company. We saw the Kochs get involved not too long after. And so this is, I say that because we would be mistaken to think this is tapping into, or at least being driven primarily by, an organic opposition that's based in something like Christian traditionalism, or that it's actually a culture war. But really this is an electoral arm as well as just a litigation strategy that's meant to shore up resources and shore up wins for this social conservative and big business alliance.
Yeah, thank you all for those answers. I actually would like to pick up with that by moving to some more specific questions for each of the panelists. My first one is for Joanna Wiest and Zane Muri, and it picks up on something that Joanna just said. So both of you have research that examines LGBTQ movement history and the promises and limitations of previous rights victories. So it's sort of flipping your answer a little bit. How have previous rights struggles impacted the current crisis the trans community is facing in the United States?
So I think that focusing on rights is what has gotten everyone into this mess in the first place. And I think that Joanna kind of introduced this already. And so I'll use the example of this legislation that is seeking to ban trans girls specifically from sports. The rights-based response is to say trans girls are girls and they have a right to compete. The response that I think actually helps people everywhere to thrive is to ask hard questions, such as, why do we segregate sports by sex in the first place? And I have this conversation a lot recently for someone who doesn't actually really care very much about sports. And it's been really interesting to think about it and read about it more. And so a lot of the reasons that are given is that it's to protect safety of girls and that it's to ensure a level playing field. And what I think is interesting about that is, if you start to pull on the thread, if we're concerned about safety for youth, then why do we allow little boys to play football when we know that there is a link between concussions during tackle football and long-term mental health and well-being? And if we're interested in securing fairness by ensuring that there's no advantage by any athlete, then why do we let children or youth from economically disadvantaged schools compete against rich schools when we could argue that that's an advantage? And so a rights-based strategy, to my mind, is not the right way to go. It's to ask questions such as this and look for solutions that undo the logic of rights and get to the core of the problem, which is that perhaps kids should not be playing tackle football. Perhaps we should just have kids compete against each other according to weight class, which we know already is something that happens in wrestling and boxing and all of these different solutions that move away from rights that is attached to identity, which in this case is understood to be gender, and towards solutions that make it possible for everyone to thrive. And I would argue that that's a queer world of possibility that exists outside of the realm of rights. And that's a world that I would love to see if we can ask different questions about things.
So to start with a very positive story, in the last several decades, scientific and medical alliances that have been made between LGBTQ plus rights advocates and trans advocates have actually won quite a few civil rights victories. A lot of the civil rights victories that we know today, same-sex marriage fights, certain trans rights to use the bathroom that accords with one's gender identity. Oftentimes you see in lobbying efforts and the kind of evidence that attorneys bring in those cases involves these scientific and these medical claims. And so advocates have won on the train of science and medicine, so much so in the last few years that every major mental health and every major medical association affirms things like transgender healthcare, affirms things like the health of same-sex or same-gender couple households. That we've come to that point, and that even right-wing medical experts are sometimes thrown out as quacks in court. They're said these aren't legitimate expert witnesses. But what bearing that has on us for us today is that a lot of these groups have recognized that change. And so what they've often done now is they've tried to undermine the idea of something called scientific certainty that we could legislate according to at all. And this extends from an earlier fight in reproductive health care politics. And so one way that Roe v. Wade was undermined in the 2000s was by the Supreme Court saying that there's some form of scientific uncertainty here that we have to take account of, that there's some mental health issues with those who have had abortions that we should consider very seriously when we're thinking about allowing restrictions on reproductive health care. And that same jurisprudence and that same rhetoric has been imported into attacks on puberty and hormonal treatments for trans children, for prison inmates who are asking for hormonal therapy or surgical procedures. And we've even seen it now leveraged in courts with involving challenges to conversion therapy bans. So saying that, despite the increasing evidence we have that they do correlate with incidents of trauma and high rates of suicidality for minors who are sent to conversion therapy offices, that we don't actually know, and that it's uncertain whether or not we should actually put any political weight behind those kinds of therapies and to ban them for the safety of children. And so I say that to recognize maybe what our very real victories using science and medicine have won, but the way that the terrain has kind of shape-shifted in the last decade or so.
Great, thank you both for those answers. I'd like now to move to Ryan Thorson. I should say you're all welcome to answer these questions as well. So do you think the anti-trans policies we are seeing in the US today are connected to LGBTQ rights struggles in other countries and internationally? And I'm thinking here specifically about things like the gay propaganda law in Russia, attacks on gender studies in Poland, et cetera. How is the movement against trans rights in the US connected to larger transnational struggles?
Yeah, I think this is one place where a human rights lens has been helpful. I think often anti-trans sentiment has been bound up with the kind of rise of authoritarian populist leaders that we've seen around the globe, and particularly where those populist leaders rise to power by demonizing minorities. It's often been sexual and gender minorities that get caught in the crosshairs. It's also migrants, it's also refugees, but often LGBT people kind of get painted as an elite concern, something that is being kind of foisted on people by liberals in the West, and that people like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Orban in Hungary, those leaders are kind of standing up to the West by demonizing LGBT people. And that strategy has been really successful in a lot of parts of the world in kind of placing people in power and retaining them in power. That's kind of dovetailed with rhetorical attacks on LGBT people, particularly under the guise of gender ideology. And this term that is often used in Latin America and Europe in particular as a kind of umbrella for a whole range of progressive stances around gender. Comprehensive sexuality education, marriage equality, trans rights, women's rights, and reproductive rights more generally. And so you'll see these leaders railing against gender ideology, and I think in some ways they're tapping into a kind of common sense around gender that can be very difficult for progressive advocates to grapple with. It's old kind of traditional stereotypes about the proper roles of men and women, who should raise a child, what kids should learn in school, and child protective rationales. And all of that coming at once and taking these really protean forms has been really difficult, I think, for advocates to grapple with. And so you've seen that come up with, lawmakers' campaigns in places like Guatemala and Costa Rica and Brazil, the peace referendum in Colombia, the anti-LGBT zones in Poland, and the end of legal gender recognition in Hungary. And that we now see some of that same language occurring like on Fox News and in political campaigns in the United States, with gender ideology becoming a kind of rallying cry for politicians and culture warriors. That's also bound up in material concerns. So there was a study done by the European Parliamentary Forum at who's funding these anti-gender campaigns in Europe, and about 60% of the funding was coming from European sources. The rest was largely from Russia and the United States. So it is not something where the US is kind of out of these debates, but is very much a part of them. And I think increasingly we're seeing a kind of bleeding of rhetoric and political strategy with the US and the rest of the world.
Great, thank you so much for that. I guess I'll next ask a question for Bobby Hodgson. So much of our discussion so far has focused on policies out of New York State. What are some of the biggest areas where we see persistent inequality for trans people in New York?
Sure. And I should say, obviously, compared to a lot of the laws that are passed around the country, New York is in many ways a mirror image, right? There are ways in which our state has passed some of the most progressive laws protecting the rights of people based on gender identity, or protecting against gender identity discrimination or other LGBTQ discrimination. At the same time, it is very much the case that there is a whole lot of discrimination that happens on the basis of gender identity that is targeted disproportionately at transgender women of color, and in particular transgender people who are targeted by the carceral state, by police, by jails and prisons, or in other ways targeted because they live at the intersection of multiple areas of discrimination, right? So we do a lot of our work around the rights of transgender people who are in custody in prisons and jails, where in New York State, it is very much the case that almost every transgender woman is housed in a men's facility, which puts her in incredible danger. It is very much the case that overwhelmingly local jurisdictions and state facilities don't provide people access to medically necessary care, to care that's consistent with what they're getting when they're not in custody, to hormone replacement therapy, to surgical interventions, to social transition, to being treated consistent with your gender identity. This is something that obviously, the NYCLU's work tries to recognize that some of the strongest work we can do is working across coalitions to highlight the ways in which intersectional forms of discrimination are really persistent and really insidious across the state, and that's where a lot of people's focus needs to be, to address these things that affect some of the folks who are targeted the most and are the most vulnerable. So that's an area where, as I said before, there is legislation that's been introduced to try and codify specific rights and responsibilities that facilities would have to follow, that, again, wouldn't fix things, but would go a long way towards providing some forms of enforcement, towards improving the situation for a large number of people who are in these facilities. We're also seeing a lot of discrimination that is around access to identity documents that properly that recognize a person's gender, right? In particular, we have a lot of clients who are non-binary, who do not have access to a form of identification that the government can issue that recognizes what their gender is. We've brought a lawsuit against the state's Office of Transitional and Disability Assistance. And I bring that up because, again, this is an area where the state is making baby steps. The state is saying this is the kind of thing that's really expensive for us to do, that's really hard for us to do. Even in recent years, they have updated their birth certificate policy to allow non-binary New Yorkers to get access to a birth certificate that properly reflects a gender marker that is neither M nor F. It's an X gender marker. But where they've dragged their feet is with people who rely on government assistance. So the Office of Transitional and Disability Assistance, which is the agency where everyone who needs emergency assistance, who needs heating assistance, housing assistance, cash assistance, who needs access to Medicaid, in order to get that, you have to fill out an application that doesn't let you identify your gender accurately. It forces you to choose an M or an F. And we have clients for whom they're faced with this choice of either lying on a government form under penalty of perjury or foregoing much needed emergency assistance. These are the types of everyday decisions that non-binary folks are forced to make every day, and that there's a lot of room for New York to do better by the people who live here. So those are two examples of some of the types of mistreatment, discrimination, et cetera, that there's a lot of work that New York could be doing. In addition, we want to be modeling better and better laws, policies, et cetera, for places around the country. New York, in some contexts, has passed, for example, has had our state education department, was one of the first education departments to pass a comprehensive set of guidance laying out what schools need to do to respect the rights of transgender students. And that was incredibly effective. Again, it wasn't perfect, and it didn't mean that that everyone experienced or was able to access their rights. But it makes a huge difference, and it was a model for a bunch of other states that followed in the years after that. So, in the similar context, we're looking for more guidance and more sort of model leading the way policies that New York could implement in the context of how it treats people in custody, in the context of policing, in the context of access to affirming care and curricula, et cetera.
Okay, thank you so much for talking about sort of what we can do to combat trans inequality in New York. So I'd like to now move on to talking about some of the specific anti-trans laws that we've seen across the country. So just to set the stage for this, what are some of the most egregious anti-trans policies that we're seeing in the US today, and why are some of these policies so problematic for the trans community?
Well, I spoke earlier about this two-pronged approach that's taking place at the moment, where there's efforts to criminalize doctors who provide care to trans youth, so people under 18, and then on the flip side, banning trans girls from competing in sports. And there was, I don't know if people saw it, but a photo of the governor of Iowa signing one of these bills into law, surrounded by all of these non-trans white girls who are the supposed beneficiaries of this law. And I spoke earlier about how by basically denying trans youth access to gender-affirming care and then conditioning participation in sports, because there's always a back door, right, where they say you have to be undergoing, you have to be medically transitioning for X number of years in order to compete, generally speaking. You're basically erasing trans youth. And I think about young trans people. I have friends who are raising a young trans girl, and I think about how she doesn't know what this looks like, but when I talk with her parents, they talk about potentially having to move from the state where they live, right, in order to protect her. And I think that, like, this is, it's impossible, it's really hard to articulate what that must be like to be a child and know that you are basically, your very existence is erased, right? And that you're being denied care in order to exist. And I'm really struck by, we're in this beautiful auditorium and I'm reading these words presumably from FDR, right? Where there's a number of freedoms that we are entitled to, and the fourth is freedom from fear. And I think about how these young children are growing up being afraid to exist in their bodies. And I think that, you know, it's hard to really articulate that, the severity of that, but I think that it's a really urgent concern and something that, again, is like being used politically, and I think Joanna spoke a little bit about this, in order to electorally make wins. It exploits ignorance that political scientists know that the general population has about trans people, and it allows these actors to say whatever it is that they want about trans youth. And a lot of it is categorically false, and a lot of trans children are going to be hurt as a result.
I might just add, the two other laws that I think have been particularly concerning are the ones in Texas and Florida, and for similar reasons. Texas, it's kind of executive instruction that providing gender-affirming care to children will be considered a form of child abuse by the Abbott administration. And I mean, I think that's obviously dangerous because it turns it not into a kind of like hands-off, we're not providing care system, which is dangerous in itself, but kind of weaponizes anti-trans rhetoric to go after parents for supporting their trans kids. And I worry that that will be replicated in other states as a way of kind of policing the provision of trans care. And I see something similar happening in Florida with the, you know, Don't Say Gay or Don't Say Gay and Trans bill, which prohibits discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. And again, that's pernicious enough in its own right, in that it kind of silences teachers' discussions, alienates LGBT kids or kids who will grow up to be LGBT. But it also has this really pernicious effect for LGBT advocates. You basically just have to accept that the state is going to erase these conversations, or if you speak up against the law and say, you know, no, this is wrong, teachers should be able to teach these things, there's an immediate accusation that's levied that you are too invested in teaching about sex and sexuality to kids. And we're seeing that weaponized in places on, you know, on Fox News and in the conservative media sphere, but also by the DeSantis administration and lawmakers who should know better. And it just puts LGBT advocates in an impossible position where you either kind of roll over and let the government come after parents of trans kids or come after people who want to teach diversity and inclusion in schools, or you're labeled as a pedophile or a child abuser. And I think those are really dangerous trends above and beyond the really horrific legislation that's being introduced kind of across the US.
Unfortunately, I think we could probably talk all night long about how horrific these laws are, and it's so true. There's just so much human cost to every one of these that's passed. The only thing that I want to add to this is that if we think about that long arc of history that I was talking about earlier and the origins of these social conservative organizations that are funded by right-wing industrialist money, in the 70s and 80s, they went after the curriculum too. And so there's this kind of long-standing attack on the curriculum, and it's in part for all these sorts of social conservative aims, but it's also because a lot of the funders of these groups want to go for public education in general. And this is just another avenue that these groups are attempting to undermine faith in public education, to turn the American people against teachers who are, in the Florida instance, accused of child grooming if they talk about their identities or if they talk about any kinds of issues that touch on sexuality and gender. And so just also that, like I said, the human cost on an individual level is also incalculable, but the broad aim here also is going after these kinds of public goods decimating public education as we know it.
I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll open it up to audience Q&A. And this is just to follow up on the most egregious policies question. Do any of these policies, do you think they conflict with federal civil rights laws or the U.S. Constitution? Are they likely to be struck down through litigation, or would it be more effective to combat them through other means?
Yes. I mean, so the answer is I think there's a necessity to combat them through every means possible, and litigation is obviously one of them. But as is public education, as is changing the hearts and minds of America, as is sort of raising up the voices of the people most affected. You asked what laws or constitutional provisions these new laws and policies violate. The answer is a lot of them. And already we are seeing. I mean, the Texas policy, to be clear, has been struck down currently. There was a lawsuit that was brought by a coalition of folks on behalf of, a parent of a child in Texas challenging this policy. And this is the one Ryan mentioned of forcing the state's child services to investigate as child abuse any provision of gender-affirming care to children. A trial judge has struck that down, has said it violates equal protection under the Texas state constitution, and also, you use every tool in the tool belt. It is also reliant on like an Administrative Procedures Act because they didn't pass it properly. But again, you do these things to minimize harm and to see how far those arguments will go. That case is working its way up and will end up before a Texas Supreme Court that is not particularly, known for being friendly to LGBTQ rights. But that said, it is such an egregious thing, and already this, one court has struck it down. There was a law in West Virginia, in Arkansas. West Virginia was a sports law. Arkansas was a provision of gender-affirming care to children law. Both of those were struck down last summer at the initial trial level, but they are working their way up through courts. So as an initial matter, I will say litigation is a tool to minimize harm and to stop these things from happening in the first instance. But it is absolutely the case that every other tool, sort of needs to be used to put as much political pressure as possible on folks to stop them from being passed in the first place, or to recede and not defend them, or to otherwise create an overwhelming necessity that these laws be abandoned.
Unless there's anything to add, I think I'll go ahead and open it to audience Q&A. Oh, let me see.
Hi, I'm Cliff Brownfield. I'm a travel writer who has not been traveling for the last 2 years. I live on the next block and come over here every chance I get. I just love them. This is kind of a crystal ball question. Anybody can answer. You can all answer. I'm worried about the midterms and Trump lining up his henchmen to primary, I think, 17 incumbents who looked at him cross-eyed. He endorsed Sarah Palin yesterday. It's like, what do you think about the midterms? Is it doom and gloom? Is it okay?
I'll say we are a nonpartisan organization, but what I worry about with the midterms is the way that they will be received, right? I think the midterms are generally just rough for whatever incumbent party is in power, and I worry that if there is kind of an aggressive right-wing sweep in the midterms, that it will be read as an endorsement of the anti-critical race theory, anti-trans policies, and a kind of mandate for lawmakers to go further. So I do think that it's particularly important for bipartisan bridge building around trans issues to elevate the voices of governors who are vetoing some of the bad legislation, sometimes with really compassionate rationales toward trans kids, and you saw that in Utah and Indiana and some other places, as much as possible to kind of prevent this from being seen as license to go even further with some of these tactics.
Hi, my name is Julia, pronounced they, them. I just want to ask each of y'all, whoever wants to answer, what would you want to tell trans kids in these states who are kind of just like fearing for like their lives right now? Right, right.
Everything. I mean, there's so much you want to say, right? If there are people fighting for you. You know, you are loved, you are heard, you are seen. You, you know, I think Zane, you were talking about the erasure that these types of laws create, and the sense that it is, you know, trying to prevent trans people and trans children from existing in public spaces and private spaces, and for me even being allowed to live. And so, you know, everything and anything about the fact that is not the case. That, you know. And also that, you know, folks are trying very hard to fight against these laws and to make you safe. And sorry.
Thank you.
And these are like state laws usually, right? Because Aaron had one 3 or 4 months ago about a discussion on legalizing sex workers. So I said, if I was arrested on a corner for sex working, I'd be arrested by a city cop, but would that be city law, safe and submit? Those are state laws enforced by city cops. So when you do work with laws, those are usually state laws.
That initially, I mean, the answer is there are, you know, there are federal laws, there are state laws, there are city ordinances, all different levels affect different things, create either protections or crimes. And so it's not an easy answer. I think in a place like New York, you have a lot of protective state laws that, for example, prohibit things like discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And some of the crimes you're talking about where a person could be arrested and put in prison for X, Y, and Z. A lot of those are state laws. We did recently successfully, I think you're talking about a panel where we talked about the repeal of the Walking While Trans law, which was a law that essentially criminalized trans women. It was couched in terms of an anti-loitering provision that would made it a crime to loiter for the purposes of prostitution. But it was just an excuse for police to target trans women and arrest them for simply standing and being trans in public. That thankfully is a state law that has since been repealed, but it was something that existed up until last year, even in New York.
I just want to jump in. I've been thinking about your question just real quick, and I think that, you know, I don't know what to say to trans youth in these states, but I do have things that I want to say to non-trans youth in those states, which is this legislation is being passed in your name, and I mean, they're kids, but, you know, I think that, I hope that there can be a cultivation of like an ethic of care, right, amongst youth, and that these are your peers, and that you shouldn't fall sway to fears that are being, you know, advanced in your name. And I think that youth are really powerful, and we're seeing this with, you know, access to guns and weapons. I mean, there are youth mobilizations, and so I would just say, like, I want to say what you said to the trans youth, but I also want to say to the non-trans youth, like, this is about you. It's being done in your name.
Hi, I'm Sanzita. Pronouns are she, her. I forgot who it was, but I think someone mentioned like parental rights and how a lot of recent policies have been, I guess, centered around parental rights and like critical race theory. So I was just interested on hearing more about that.
So I dug into the text of the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, and it's really stunning because it reads, this is about preserving a parent's fundamental right to control their children. And I think that this is, again, where it's like rights don't take us down the right path, right? And we saw this with Obergefell, which is, you know, extending the right to same-sex marriages, but under the sort of this dignity jurisprudence that was advanced, that then gets turned on its head with Masterpiece and says, well, whose dignity are we protecting? Is it the baker who has the dignity to religious affiliation, or is it the same-sex couple that is looking to get a cake, right? And so I think that it's an alarming bill, and I think that it's casting parental rights in really disturbing language about controlling children that we should be really concerned about.
And I will just say, I also think of this as a children's rights issue, right? And that's maybe less apparent in the U.S. context, which the U.S. is the one country that hasn't signed the Convention on the Rights, or hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But everywhere else, this is very much a children's rights issue, where children also have the right to access information that's beneficial to their health and well-being. They have the right to seek out health services that are supportive of them. They have a right to an education. There's all of these things that I think are rhetorically powerful to remind people of, that it's not just about the parents and teachers and who decides. It's about what effect do these laws have on kids, and the right of a kid to have a bathroom that they can use at their school. And one story that always sticks with me when I had done the research in South Dakota was a student who did not have a bathroom that they could use at school. Would leave the school, and I think it was go to a gas station every day at lunch to use the bathroom, right? Like, never ate lunch with their peers because they had to go and use the bathroom at some point during the day. And to tell that story to lawmakers and say, what are the rights of the child in this instance, and what kind of a learning environment are you providing them? I think often that gets overlooked in the kind of framing of these as parental rights issues, and I think there's been a real missed opportunity to elevate the consequences for trans kids in the way that I think the right in particular is elevating the voices of parents in these debates.
Hello, my name's Mac. I'm a staff member here at Roosevelt House. There have been as many as 75 people watching on Zoom tonight, and I have some questions that I'll ask on their behalf now. Here's a question from Kira Lingala. Kira says that they work at an LGBTQ center in Westchester, and we've joined efforts to make Bedford Hills Correctional Facility more affirming for the trans men and non-binary folks who are held there. What are some of the specific challenges faced by transmasculine individuals in the carceral system?
Thank you so much for that question, and that really raises up, I think, a narrative that we don't hear enough about. I think, as you pointed out, so Bedford Hills is a state correctional facility that is considered, it's a women's facility, and in that facility they house a great number of transmasculine people, trans men. I think I should clarify that we spoke earlier about trans people's right to be housed in a manner consistent with their gender identity if that is what they so choose. So a trans woman's right to be in a women's facility because it is safer for her and because she will be exposed to a great deal of danger and harm in a men's facility. At the same time, it is very much the case that for many trans men, they are simply not safe in a men's facility, and so by their own choice, they request to be placed in Bedford Hills. This is, again, a problem, an inherent problem. There are many inherent problems with the carceral state, right? Like with these carceral settings in general and their existence. But for people who are placed in a place like Bedford Hills, you get a lot of issues with people not having access, simply not being treated with respect, not being, being misgendered regularly, not having access to medication, to hormone therapy, to surgery, also not having access to basic sort of commissary items and clothing that is both part of their social transition and something that they would be able to do if they were not in custody, and is also something that other men in custody are allowed to have. So you see a lot of these problems. You see a lot of problems with folks being targeted for harassment by staff and by other people who are in custody. And you see a lack of protection for people. So a lack of responsiveness when they raise these issues about their safety or seek some sort of some help. You do often see people placed in essentially solitary confinement in the name of their own safety when they do not want that and have not requested it. Because the facility says it can't otherwise keep them safe. Again, this is something that's against the law and that should never be the case. But these are the types of things that we see across the board in our state corrections facilities and in a lot of local jails as well.
I would be remiss in my role as an academic who is not on the hook for crafting policy at all if I did not say that the way to make people comfortable in contexts of incarceration is to remove incarceration and not have it be an element of the criminal punishment system. So that would be my answer as to how to address the problems that transmasculine people face in incarceration and detention, is to get rid of that. And there are a number of people whose work you can read who imagine this possibility. Angela Davis has been talking about this for a really long time. And so if people want to know more, I would direct you there as a start.
And here's a question from Sharon Gerard. She asks about how many trans women are now incarcerated in New York State. And I guess to make the question more than just a matter of a number, maybe talk about the disproportionality with which trans women are incarcerated, and trans women of color in particular.
So again, thank you for this question. And I'm really pleased that people are focused very much on this issue that is affecting New York right now. So the answer is, number one, we don't have that data because it is not being properly tracked. That is, again, something that the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act, which everyone should tell their legislators support, would go some way towards fixing. There would be reporting requirements regarding people's requests for gender-affirming care, regarding people who self-identify as trans in custody. Right now, that information is simply not tracked. So we're certainly aware of hundreds of people in state custody and many, many more who are in local facilities that are not run by the state, but are run by local jurisdictions at any one time. Overwhelmingly, these are trans women, and overwhelmingly and disproportionately, they are trans women of color. This is a fact of our policing system and the racist and transphobic policies that lead to people being targeted and arrested. From the start to the finish of the carceral system, people who are being targeted are going to be disproportionately showing up in these places. And so it is very much the fact that this is an issue that's affecting folks who are targeted for discrimination from the police because of how they look and who they are from the moment they're walking outside, and then they get placed in custody in some sort of setting because of that initial interaction, and it goes from there.
Say this, we're about at time, so I think this will be our last question, and then we'll wrap up the event.
Hi, how are y'all doing? Good. My name is Lenny. I'm a community organizer based in Harlem. I have a couple of questions, sorry. I know we're running low on time. My first one is for Ryan. So I remember you speaking about just the ways that we've seen anti-trans policy increase on behalf of the United States and on behalf of imperialism worldwide. And so I'm wondering how we might be able to connect the enforcement of rigid gender binaries here by the police to, say, the apartheid regime in Palestine right now, and the fact that the U.S. has the most military bases worldwide, if there's a connection to how hypermilitarism impacts people who are outside of rigid gender binaries. Bobby, you had mentioned that here in New York State, misogynoir is rampant. There's a myriad of problems in the police and policing system, prison system, jail system for low-income folks. And I'm wondering, specifically, we know that LGBTQ struggle would not exist without Black trans women and their organizing in the 60s. I'm wondering if maybe one of the organizers can answer this, why there are no Black trans people on the panel. Just what kind of went into that decision, or what that says about the epistemology of how we've come to understand transphobia and misogynoir in an event like this. And then finally, I'm wondering, I believe it was maybe Ryan who had mentioned this, or I think it was actually Bobby, now that I'm thinking of it, but what are some other tools that we have in our tool belt besides policy? Of course, policy is extremely important in reaching out to our senators and our congresspeople in combating anti-trans violence, but I'm wondering what are some other ways that we are able to, you had mentioned it briefly, but put pressure on yes, our senators and our congresspeople, but how do we talk to everyday people? How do we talk to low-income people about what is happening to our trans brothers, sisters, and siblings in the streets? And ways to advance that sort of knowledge production. And then finally, if you have time to touch on it, I'm wondering more about this this concept of putting X as a gender marker on documents, and if that hypervisibility actually has the opposite intended effect of making trans people, specifically Black trans people and trans people of color, more vulnerable to state attacks if they do have that X on their gender marker. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for all of those questions. Those are wonderful. I just want to say real quick that one of the things that the X gender marker does, in addition to making people hypervisible and potentially subjected to more discrimination, is that it retrenches the gender binary, right? It says basically that there is this third space that people can opt into that naturalizes male and female as the most legible options, right? And so I think this is always, like with gender neutral spaces, we see this as well. And so I think at any point in time when we're segregating by sex assigned at birth, we need to be asking questions about what the effect is of creating a third space, or why we're even segregating by sex in the first place. So thank you for those questions.
And I'll just respond to the first one quickly. I think that, you know, one of the benefits of looking beyond US borders at some of these issues is that there are really good innovative models elsewhere in the world that I think we often overlook in the United States. And so, you know, I think of like India and Pakistan and Nepal and some of the protections for kind of third gender minorities, which may not be perfect, but give a different way of thinking about these issues. I think of, you know, Argentina and Uruguay, which have both adopted different kind of quota systems for employment for trans people, like reparations for policy decisions that were made against trans people in the past, and then kind of public apology and recognition of the way that trans people have suffered under military regimes. That there's models like that we're not adopting here that I think are really useful. And then, you know, you also highlighted apartheid in Palestine and some of those issues, and I think that there's also it's important to always keep in mind the way that section gender can also be used in kind of homo-nationalist projects, or can be used to license, you know, military conduct abroad. And I think you're seeing that right now in Russia and Ukraine, right? Like the way that Russia has framed its invasion of Ukraine as a way of pushing back against kind of Western sexual excess is not an insignificant part of what it is doing. And that applies not just in the Russia context, but also in, you know, the way that women's rights were mobilized in the US invasion of Afghanistan and in other militaristic projects. And so I don't know that I have a direct line to draw between the state laws, or I'd need to think about it more, but I do think that those are an important cluster of issues to keep in mind.
Yeah, do you want to make one final comment?
Those are all amazing questions. I want to answer all of them, but very, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. You know, you specifically asked about this question of sort of what can be done other than sort of policy advocacy or whatever. I think, you know, this is something I struggle with personally. I think my organization struggles with, the movement struggles with, in terms of trying to think of the most helpful and way to push forward policy goals that is also not doing harm and not doing active harm or doing less harm. You know, just some of those are like, we as an organization need to, and I as a person, you know, step back when possible to raise up the stories of the people who are directly affected, specifically the Black trans women who are at the center of so many of our lawsuits and our struggles, and the struggles that are pushing for the policy change, and have as many strategies as possible to center those stories whenever possible, while also taking the labor off of, you know, for example, I have a client who is a Black trans woman who it is an incredible amount of emotional labor for her to like continually tell her story, even though that's an incredibly effective way to explain to people what's happened to her. So it's this balancing between saying like, you are the most effective messenger, you are the one leading this, while at the same time, wherever possible, taking some of the pressure off, finding strategies to say like, you have told it once in a video and now we can distribute that on your behalf. Or we will step back and be an organization that provides resources to trans-led organizations that are leading our coalitions, and doing, you know, contributing legal work and research where it's helpful, contributing X, Y, and Z of whatever our organizational power is, but very much stepping back and taking a back seat to the trans-led organizations and the community members who are in fact leading that fight. And I want to say those are the people who are leading the fight for the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act, and for a lot of the policy stuff that I'm talking about here. And so it's a matter of being a resource, being helpful, while also very much stepping back and trying to balance those things all at once.
Can I say one thing on this? Just to all these wonderful comments, just about the what can we do and what should the broader horizon of change look like. I don't think that we should forget the role that labor unions have played in gender and sexual equality in history. In the 30s, we saw the first multiracial queer union forming. The Village Voice union pushed for domestic partner benefits. A union-led coalition helped fight back against a law in California that would have criminalized being gay or lesbian and a school teacher in public schools. And some unions have been instrumental in fights against bathroom bills in certain states. And so it's just a real locus of power to fight for gender and sexual equality, both within unions, within a workplace, but in terms of the policy realm too. And we need a source of working class power and labor power to fight back against those social conservative organizations that are bankrolled by big, dark money. We need to change that balance between big business, big, dark money, right-wing industrialists, and the kind of decimated state that American labor is in today. And that's kind of really getting also at the root of that imbalance and what makes these attacks on gender and sexual minorities so potent.
Well, I guess I'm going to finish. But first, I would like to thank you so much for your question about event diversity. When we started the event, we actually reached out to a large number of queer and trans people of color. Unfortunately, because we're in the middle of such a crisis, it was difficult to find someone who could fit this spot. But with that said, I think that also let me know as an event organizer what we can do to try to make sure that they're featured in future panels. I was able to make a lot of contacts, so hopefully we'll have that in future panels. Also, we have speaker honorariums, and we've increased our speaker honorarium recently so we can have more representation for marginalized populations and hopefully plan them further in advance so we can give people more times so that they can find time in their schedule to come. So that's one of the biggest goals I have at the Policy Center, is to try to increase a diversity of speakers. And on that note, we do actually have 2 events coming up that will focus, one of which is going to focus on, that's set for June 9th, I believe, at 5 p.m. during Pride Month, with Hugh Ryan, who's the author of When Brooklyn Was Queer. And he's going to be speaking about his new book, Women's House of Detention, A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison, about the Women's Detention Center in Greenwich Village. Why am I blanking on it? The obvious landmark. And that is going to be moderated by Professor Keisha Middlemoss from Howard University. And we're hoping to plan an event on May 4th that will either feature LGBTQ politicians in the city. As you all know, our city council has one of the most diverse, LGBTQ city council that we've had in history. So we're hoping to either have some of them come, or we'll do an event on LGBTQ homelessness on that date. So we're still in the process of putting it together. So I guess what I'll do is try to end. I'm sorry we went over time. It was a lot of really excellent questions. I really would like to thank Harold Holzer, the director of the Roosevelt House Policy Institute, Mac Barrett, and our other staff, Alexis Fisher and Bianca, and everyone who helped put this event together. I'd like to thank all the panelists and audience members for such wonderful questions. And we do have a reception after the event. You're welcome to come for some food and wine. And please do come to our future events. We're hoping to make them just better and better as we come out of the pandemic, and just speak to the broadest range of people in the community that we can. All right, thank you.